I came to Hale's Reach on the last cold night of the old year, half a corpse in a stolen coat, and I did not expect to leave it alive. The shuttle that dropped me had been a smuggler's, and the smuggler had made it plain with his eyes that he would sooner have sold me than carried me, and that only the color of the coin had kept his hands off my throat. He set me down 2 ridges from the settlement lights and lifted off before the ramp had fully closed, and I stood in snow to my knees and watched his running lamps shrink into the black and understood that I was, for the first time in my life, entirely without value to anyone. You must understand what that meant to me to grasp the rest of it. I had been born the daughter of a dynasty 900 years unbroken. I had been weighed from the hour of my nomming in the currency of what I could hold: a throne, a fleet, the loyalty of 40 worlds. Every hand that had ever reached for me had been reaching truly for the thing behind me. I had known this the way you know the weather, without resentment, because it was simply the sky I lived under. And then the sky had fallen. My regent, whom I had trusted as I trusted my own breath, had opened the palace to soldiers who were not mine, and the crown had wobbled, and in the space of one night I had learned exactly how much I was worth when the throne was taken away. Nothing. I was worth nothing. My own guard had stepped aside. The ministers who had kissed my rings had bowed instead to Osek, who had my father's blood on his sleeve and my death already written into the records, presumed lost with the imperial yacht over the Sarin Deep. A clean lie, a tidy one, and in a way it was true, because the woman they had made into an empire was gone, and what walked away through the servants' tunnels that night was only a body that had not yet been told it was dead. So when I stood in the snow of Combe and felt the cold reach into me like a hand into a pocket, I was not afraid the way a person is afraid. I had passed through fear into the flat country beyond it. I began to walk toward the lights because a body walks toward warmth, and for no better reason than that. The lights were a farm. I did not know that word then in the way I know it now. I knew fields from the air, the great managed belts of the crop worlds, tended by machines and by castes bred for tending. This was not that. This was a low sprawl of buildings hunched against a hillside, roof steep to shed the snow, and lamps burning yellow in 3 windows, and beyond the buildings a stretch of frost fields going silver blue under 2 moons, the rows of some hardy winter grain standing dead and stubborn against the white. And moving among the rows, slow as grazing beasts, were machines, old harvester units, patched and rust-streaked, their joints wrapped in rag and wire, muttering to themselves in the mechanical way of things kept alive long past their proper deaths. One of them turned its sensor cluster toward me as I passed the fence line, and made a sound like an old man clearing his throat, and went back to its work. It did not raise an alarm. It did not care what I was. I would learn later that the crew called that one Gable, and that Bram had kept it running for 11 years past the point any sensible farmer would have scrapped it. Out of a stubbornness I came in time to love in him. But that first night it was only a rusted shape in the snow that looked at me and found me beneath its notice, and even that small indifference was a mercy after the year I had lived through. I got as far as the yard before my legs stopped agreeing to carry me. I remember the door opening. I remember the shape of a man against the yellow light, big through the shoulders, a lamp in one hand and the other resting easy on the frame, and I remember thinking with the last clear thought I had that here it came, the bounty, the recognition, the reaching hand, and that I was too tired to run from it and would simply let it happen. I had a knife in my boot. I did not reach for it. That is how tired I was. The man came down the steps. He crouched in the snow in front of me and held the lamp up between us, and I made myself meet his eyes because a Surcon meets what is coming, and I waited for the thing I saw in every face. The calculation, the price, the hunger of a hand that has found something it can sell. It was not there. He looked at me the way you look at weather rolling in. He looked at the frost on my coat and the blue in my lips and the way I had stopped being able to hold myself upright. And whatever he saw, it was not a crown and it was not a bounty. It was a person freezing in his yard. "You picked a poor night for it," he said. That was all. He put an arm under me and got me up, and he was strong the way working men are strong, without display, and he half carried me up the steps and into the yellow light and the heat, and I passed out somewhere on the threshold of it with my face against the rough wool of his coat, and I did not once in all of that feel a hand go through my pockets. His name was Bram Hale. I did not learn it for 2 days, because for 2 days I burned with the fever the cold had planted in me, and in the burning I said things I should not have said, in a language he could not have known, and I have never asked him what he heard. When I finally came up out of it, I was in a narrow bunk in a warm room that smelled of wood smoke and machine oil and some bitter herb, and there was a bowl of broth going cold on a stool beside me, and a woman I did not know was sitting in the corner mending a harness by lamplight and pretending not to watch me. Her name was Sella. She was old, and she had run the Reach's kitchen and its accounts for 30 years, and she had a face like a wintered apple and eyes that missed nothing. When she saw I was awake, she brought the broth and held the back of my head up with a hand harder than any hand I had ever been touched by, and she fed me a spoonful at a time and told me to shut up when I tried to speak, because I had no strength to spare for words. Later, a day, 2 days, the fever time runs together. Bram came and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which I came to know was a thing he did when he had a question he did not much want to ask. "You've no papers," he said. "No," I said. "Registry'd want papers, if I logged you proper." I said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not be a lie or a rope around my own neck, and I had reached the end of my lying. He turned his hat around in his hands once. "Weather's shut the passes till the turning at least," he said. "Registry man doesn't come out this far in winter anyhow. Reckon it can wait." He looked at me then, plainly. "You steady enough to work?" I did not understand the question. In my old life no one had ever asked whether I was steady enough to work. Work was a thing that happened below me, done by hands I never saw. I stared at him. "Because I don't keep folk who don't work," he said, gentler now, reading my silence wrong, thinking I had heard a threat in it. "But I don't turn folk out in a calm winter either. So it's the one or the other, and I'd rather it was the first, on account of I'm short a hand since Corwin took the coast road. You'll earn your bunk and your bowl, that's the whole of it." That was the whole of it. I want to tell you what that did to me, and I find I do not have the words even now in this language or my own. He did not ask what I had been. He did not ask what I was worth. He offered me the smallest and plainest thing a person can be offered, a place, in exchange for the work of my own 2 hands, and he offered it to a stranger with no papers and no name and a fever secret she talked in her sleep, and he offered it without one flicker of the reaching I had spent my whole life bracing against. "Ilma," I said. It was my old nurse's name. It was the first word my mother had ever taught me. "My name is Ilma." "Ilma," he said, trying it, and nodded like it would do. "Bram Hale, you met Sella. There's the crew, you'll sort them out. Rest till you can stand, then find me in the machine barn." He put his hat back on and went out, and I lay in the warm dark and did something I had not done since the night the palace fell. I wept. Not for grief. I had wept the grief out on the yacht over the Sarin Deep. I wept because a man had looked at me and seen a person, and I had not known until that moment how starved I was for it. That was the beginning of my winter at Hale's Reach. The work was hard and I was bad at it, and no one held either against me for long. I learned the frost fields, the winter grain they called iron wheat, which is planted in the autumn and stands dead through the cold, and is not truly dead at all but only waiting, holding its life clenched down small against the frost, to burst green the moment the year turns. I learned the harvester bots, Gable and the 2 younger threshers, and the seed drill they called the widow, because it had killed a man 40 years back, and no one had ever quite trusted it since. I learned to rap their joints against the cold and coax their old motors and swear at them in the settler way, which I found deeply satisfying, having spent my life among people who would never have dreamed of swearing at anything in my hearing. I learned Sella's kitchen and the accounts she kept in a hand like bird scratch. I learned the other hands. There were 4 besides me, rough and kind and incurious, the sort of people the frontier collects, each with a past they did not discuss and the courtesy not to ask after anyone else's. Among them I was only Ilma. The stray Bram had pulled out of the snow, quiet, quick to learn, no trouble. It was the smallest identity I had ever worn, and it fit me like nothing ever had. And I learned Bram. He was a widower. Sella told me that, not him. His wife had died 4 winters back of a lung sickness the settlement's one doctor could not turn, and he had buried her under the ridge oak and gone on running the reach because the reach was the thing his hands knew how to do. He was not a talker. He was one of those men whose kindness is entirely in his doing and almost never in his saying. He would not tell you he had noticed you were cold. He would put more wood in the stove. He would not ask if the work was too much for you. He would quietly take the heavier end of it and leave you the lighter and let you keep your pride. I watched him do these things, first for me and then, once I had eyes to see it, for everyone. And I understood that I had spent my whole life surrounded by people trained in the appearance of care and had never once, until that frost farm, been in the presence of the real thing. The first time he did it for me on purpose, the first time I was sure it was for me, was the day the widow threw a drive band and caught my sleeve and would have taken my arm to the shoulder if the old motor had not been half dead and slow. I got clear with nothing worse than a wrenched wrist and a torn coat and the shakes, and I stood in the cold barn holding my own arm and waiting, out of some deep and ugly reflex, to be told it was my fault, because in the old court a mistake was always someone's fault, and that someone was always the one below. Bram killed the widow's motor, and looked at my wrist, and the tear in my sleeve and the white in my face. "My fault," he said. "Should have scrapped that thing before it scrapped somebody. You're done for today, go let Sella wrap that." It was not his fault. It was mine. I had reached across the band when I knew better, and he took it onto himself as easy as breathing, not to flatter me, not to buy anything, but because he could see I was frightened and he did not want me to carry the fright as well as the sprain. I went to let Sella wrap my wrist, and I could not, for a while, speak, and Sella, who missed nothing, said, "He does that," and left it there, and wrapped my wrist. And that was the day I stopped being able to tell myself that Bram Hale's decency was ordinary. It was ordinary. That was the terrible, wonderful thing about it. It was the plainest decency in the world, the kind that a good man spends on everyone without keeping accounts. It was only that I had lived 40 years without once being on the receiving end of the ordinary sort, and so to me it was a miracle, and I hoarded each small instance of it like a woman starving hoards bread. I buried the crown in the 3rd week. I had carried it all that way, not the great state crown which was gone with the palace, but the traveling circlet, the thin band of star iron that a Surkon is never without, that is grown to the daughter's measure at her nomming, and is meant to be burned with her at her death. It was the last true thing I had. It was proof of what I was, and it was a rope around my neck, and I had carried it sewn into the lining of the stolen coat through the coldest weeks of my life. I took it out one night when the crew slept, and I went into the machine barn where Gable stood dark and dreaming on his charge plate, and I lifted a loose board in the corner where the old floor had rotted, and I laid the circlet down in the frozen dirt beneath and set the board back over it. Star iron does not rust. It would keep. And I stood over the place in the dark, and I said to it, in my own language, the words a Surkon says over the dead, because the Empress was dead and I was only Ilma now, and I meant it to be a burial and not a hiding. Gable's sensor cluster woke and swung toward me and made its old man throat-clearing sound, and I put my hand on his cold, rusted flank and said, "Go back to sleep," and he did. He was the only witness to the burial of the last Empress of the Thren Dominion, an 11 years obsolete harvester bot that his farmer loved too much to scrap, and I have always been glad it was him. He did not care what I was. There is no purer witness than that. The turning came on. The settlers of Combe keep a festival at the deep of winter, at the longest night, when the year turns from dark toward light. They call it the turning, and it is the great feast of their calendar. The one night the scattered farms of the frontier all come down to Coldwater. The settlement, such as it is, a chapel and a store and a smith and 40 houses, and they light the great fire in the square and eat and drink and dance and stay up to see the first thin light of the new year come over the ridge. And they say to one another at that first light, an old word that means both welcome and home, the same word. Because to them, the turning of the year is the world coming home to the light. Bram had not gone to the turning since his wife died. Sella told me that too. 4 years he had sent the crew and stayed at the reach with his machines, and 4 years no one had said anything about it, because on the frontier a man's grief is his own business. But that winter, some days before the longest night, he came into the kitchen where Sella and I were putting up the preserves, and he stood in the door with his hat in his hands, and he said, not to me exactly, but into the room, "Reckon we'll all go down to the turning this year. Whole crew, shut the place up for the night." Sella did not look up from the jars. "That's so," she said. "That's so," said Bram, and put his hat back on and went out. Sella looked at me then, one long look over the top of a jar of winter pears, and she did not say anything. But I understood that something had shifted in the house, that I did not have the frontier's grammar to read, and that it had shifted around me, and I looked down at my hands stained with fruit, and did not know what to do with the warmth that rose in me. We went down to Coldwater on the eve of the longest night, the whole crew packed in the old ground hauler with the machines left muttering in the dark fields behind us, and I saw the great fire in the square before we saw the town, a column of gold against the black, and I heard the noise of it, the music and the voices, and I was afraid. I had stood in 1,000 halls full of people. I had walked the length of the great throneway with 40 worlds' worth of eyes upon me and not felt fear. But those had been eyes that saw the crown. These were people who would see Ilma, the farm hand, the stray, and I found I cared what they saw, and caring was a thing I had forgotten how to survive. Bram must have seen it in me, because as we came into the firelight he said, low, only to me, "They're good folk. You'll do." And then, because he was who he was, he said no more, and he did not take my arm to lead me in, but he walked beside me at a pace I could match, so that I came into the light of the turning fire not alone and not led, but accompanied, which is a different and better thing, and I have never forgotten that he knew the difference. I will not pretend I remember all of that night in order. I remember the heat of the great fire on my face, and the cold of the snow at my back. I remember Sella pressing a cup of something spiced and strong into my hands. I remember a child, Bram's neighbor's girl, a small fierce creature named Wren, who had decided in the course of the winter that I belonged to her, dragging me by the hand into the ring of dancers, and laughing at my clumsiness with the pure cruelty and pure love of the very young. I remember eating food I could not name and finding it good. I remember, once, catching Bram watching me across the fire with an expression I had no name for, and that he wiped away the moment our eyes met, turning to say something to old Cass Odell, who farmed the next ridge and had never trusted my missing papers, and watched me all night with a suspicion I could feel like a draft. And I remember that I was, for the length of that night, happy, a plain and enormous happiness, the happiness of a person among people who wanted nothing from her but her company, and I remember thinking that I would give the whole of the Thren dominion, every world and fleet and stone of it, never to have to be anything again, but Ilma at the turning fire with the child pulling at her hand, and the quiet man watching her across the flames. The skyfall came a little before midnight. I felt it before I saw it, the old instinct, bred into me deeper than any burial could reach, the Empress's instinct for a warship's approach, a pressure in the air, a wrongness in the dark above the ridge. And then the music faltered as, one by one, the settlers felt it too, and turned their faces up, and saw the lights coming down out of the black, not the yellow of a shuttle's running lamps, but the cold white and the deep imperial red of a Thren cruiser, dropping through the winter sky over Coldwater, vast and silent and utterly, catastrophically out of place above a frontier farming town on the longest night of the year. The whole square went still. 90 people more standing in the firelight with their faces turned up, and the child's hand tightening in mine, and Bram suddenly at my shoulder, and Cass Odell's voice somewhere behind me saying, low and ugly, "That's a warship. That's a Thren warship." What in the cold hells is a Thren warship doing over cold water? And every eye in that square beginning slowly to turn from the sky toward the one person among them who had come from nowhere with no papers in the dead of winter. I let go of Wren's hand. I did not want her small hand in mine when whatever was coming came. I stepped a little apart from the crowd, out toward the edge of the firelight and the snow beyond, because I had brought this down on them and the least I could do was carry it away from the fire. I heard Bram say my name, Ilma, half a question, and I did not turn because I could not in that moment bear to see the reaching come into his face at last, the recognition, the price. It always came. I had let myself forget that it always came. The cruiser did not land. It hung above the square, and from its belly a smaller ship dropped, a barge, imperial red and white, and it came down in the snow at the edge of the light with the grace of a thing that has never once in its existence had to be careful of cost, and its ramp came down, and the loyal dead of my old life walked out into the firelight of the turning. I knew them. That was the thing that broke me, that I knew them. At the head of the company, in the deep red of the fleet warden's office, was Isel Servan, who had captained my father's flagship and taught me the names of the stars from an observation deck when I was a child, and whom I had last seen kneeling in the wreck of the palace, with a wound across his face that the firelight showed me had never fully healed. Behind him came his company, 40 of the Dominion's own, in the red and white, armed and armored and moving with the terrible discipline of people who have crossed a great darkness on the strength of a single hope. Isel came across the snow and stopped in the firelight, and he looked at me, at Ilma, at the farmhand in her patched coat with fruit stains still under her nails, and I watched his face and I braced, as I had braced my whole life, for the reaching. His face broke. Not into hunger, not into calculation, into grief and disbelief, and a joy so raw it was terrible to witness, the joy of a man who has crossed a year of darkness on a hope he did not dare believe and has now, past all hope, found the thing at the end of it alive. His eyes filled. This hard old warrior who had taught me the stars stood in the snow of a frontier farm and wept the way I had wept in the dark of Bram's warm room, because he had found me, and I was alive, and I understood all at once that not everyone in my old life had been reaching. Some of them had loved me. Some of them had crossed the dark to find me and not the crown. "Majesty," said Isel Servan, and his voice broke on the word. And then he knelt. He went down into the snow of Coldwater Square on both knees, the fleet warden of the Thren Dominion, in front of 90 frontier settlers and a dying bonfire, and behind him his 40 went down as one, a great soft crash of armor into snow, and they bowed their heads, all of them, to the farm hand at the edge of the firelight, and Isel said, in the old tongue, and then in the settlers' tongue so all could hear it, "The Dominion did not believe you dead. We never believed it. We have searched a year for you, Majesty, from the Sarin Deep to the frontier's end, and we have found you, and we have come to bring you home. Osek's lie is finished. The loyal worlds are waiting. Command us." I stood in the firelight with my 40 loyal dead kneeling in the snow before me and the whole of Coldwater starring, and I felt the old life close its hand around me again. The crown, the throne, the 40 worlds, the weight of the thing I had been born to be, coming down over my shoulders like the stolen coat coming off and my true skin going back on, and I understood that I could have it back. All of it. That I had only to say the word to Isel and I would be the Empress again, and the frost farm and the machines and the turning fire and the quiet man would fall away behind me like a fever dream, a thing that had happened to a body that had not yet been told it was dead. I turned to look at Bram Hale. I had to know. Before I said anything to Isel, before I let the old life take me back, I had to see his face, because the whole of that winter had come down to this one thing, and I had to know whether it had been real. The firelight was on his face, and there was no reaching in it. There was no calculation, no sudden new appraisal of the stray he'd pulled from the snow now that he saw what she was worth. There was only Bram, looking at me across the kneeling armor and the imperial red, and what was in his face was not awe and not greed, but something much smaller and much larger than either. It was concern. He was watching to see if I was all right. 40 warriors were kneeling in his settlement square, and a warship was hanging over his neighbors' heads, and imperial politics had just crashed down onto the frontier. And Bram Hale was looking at me across all of it to see, only to see, whether I was frightened, whether I needed him to do the thing he always did, whether he should quietly take the heavier end of this and leave me the lighter and let me keep my pride. He had known me one winter. He had known me as a stray with no papers and stained nails, a hand who was bad at the work and learned it slow, a woman who talked in a strange tongue in her fevers and buried something under his barn floor by night, thinking he did not know. He had known all that, and he had never once asked what I was worth, because it had never once occurred to him that a person's worth was a thing you asked after. And now he knew what I was, and it changed nothing in his face, because to Bram Hale I had never been a crown to begin with. I had been Ilma, who was cold in his yard, and that was the whole of it, and it had always been the whole of it, and it would be the whole of it if I walked onto that barge and never came back, or if I stayed at the reach till the ridge oak grew over us both. That was the recognition, not theirs, kneeling in the snow. His, standing plain in the firelight, seeing me and only me. It had been there all winter. I had simply been too broken by my old life to believe a thing could be so freely given. I turned back to Isel Servan, kneeling in the snow with his scarred face turned up to me, waiting for his Empress to command him. "Stand up, old friend," I said. "You're frightening the child." He stood. The 40 stood behind him, and I saw the confusion move across his face, because an Empress reclaimed does not begin with the standing of her warriors. She begins with the nomming of her enemies and the ordering of her fleet. I did not do that. I walked across the trampled snow, past the kneeling company as they rose, and I went to where Bram Hale stood at the edge of his own settlement's firelight with his neighbors starring, and old Cass Odell's suspicion turned finally, horribly, to fear, and I stopped in front of him. And I took his hand, the big, scarred, work-hard hand that had pulled me out of the snow and never once gone through my pockets, and I turned, holding it, to face my loyal dead and the whole of Coldwater, so that all of them, mine and his, could see. "This is Bram Hale," I said, and I pitched my voice the way an Empress is taught to pitch it, so that it carried to the last row of a great hall, so that it carried now to the last frightened settler and the last kneeling warrior and up, I did not doubt, to the cold bridge of the cruiser itself. He is a farmer of Combe. He pulled a dying stranger out of the snow on the last night of the old year, and gave her work and a bunk and a bowl, and never once asked her name until she was ready to give it. He did not know what I was. He did not care what I was. He is the only person in the reach of my whole life who ever looked at me and saw not a throne but a person freezing in his yard, and reached out his hand for that, and for nothing else. I felt his hand go still in mine. I did not look at him. I could not yet. "The Dominion is mine," I said to Isel, to all of them. "I will take it back. Ossec's lie ends and the loyal worlds will have their Empress again, and there will be a reckoning, and I will make it. I did not spend this winter learning to be a coward." A sound went through the kneeling company at that, something between a breath and a cheer, quickly stilled. "But hear me, all of you, and carry it to the last world of the Dominion. I did not survive because I was an Empress. Empresses do not survive. They are propped up by the value of their thrones until the throne wobbles and the props step aside. And I know that now because I watched every prop I had step aside in one night. I survived because a frontier farmer who owed me nothing and could not have named my dynasty if you'd held a blade to him, decided that a freezing stranger was worth more to him than the trouble of turning her away. That is the whole of why I am alive to command you. Remember it. I intend to." Then I turned to Bram Hale, and I let myself look at him at last, and my own composure, which had held through the fall of a palace and a year of running and the kneeling of my loyal dead, came at last to the end of itself. My eyes filled. I did not let the tears fall. A Surkon does not weep before a kneeling fleet, but I let him see them, standing close in the firelight, where only he could. "You have never asked me a single thing," I said low for him alone. "So I will tell you the one thing, and then I will ask you the one thing, and you will not have to wonder. What I was is an empress. What I am is Ilma, who was cold in your yard and is not cold anymore. And what I want," my voice did the thing it had never done in 900 years of trained Surkon control. It broke, and I let it break. "Is for you to come with me, not as a farmer follows a crown, but as the man who taught me what a crown is worth. Which is nothing, Bram. Nothing at all, next to a place by a fire and a bowl and a person who does not ask your price. I have to go and take back a dominion I have discovered I do not much want, because it is mine and my people are waiting, and I would rather do it beside you than be worshipped by 40 worlds without you. That is the one thing I am asking. You have never told me a thing you didn't have to. Tell me this." The great fire cracked and threw sparks up into the black where the cruiser hung. The kneeling company had risen and stood in the red and white, watching their empress hold a farmer's hand at the edge of the light. 90 settlers watched, and old Cass Odell watched, and the child Wren watched with her mouth open, and somewhere up the dark road the machines of Hale's Reach stood muttering in the empty fields, Gable and the threshers and the widow, tending the iron wheat that lay clenched down small under the frost, holding its life against the cold, waiting for the year to turn. Bram Hale looked at me for a long moment. He was a man whose kindness was entirely in his doing and almost never in his saying, and I saw him reach, for once in his life, past the doing and toward the saying, because he understood that this once the saying was the thing. He turned his hand in mine, so that instead of me holding his, we held each other's, palm to palm, the frontier way, the way that means an equal and not a subject. "Reckon the iron wheat'll keep," he said. "It always does." And then, because he was who he was and because it was the largest thing he had ever said and he could only say it small, he said, "Sella can run the Reach. She's run everything else for 30 years, and I've been to about enough turnings alone." He looked at me, plain, steady, no reaching in it ever. "I'll come, Ilma, wherever it is. I'd have come if you were still just the stray with no papers. That you turn out to be an empress is," and here the corner of his mouth moved, the nearest thing to a smile I had yet earned from him, "well, it's a poor night for it, but I've had worse." Behind us, over the ridge, the first thin light of the new year came up gray and then gold, and the cry went through the settlers of Coldwater, the old word that means both welcome and home, the same word, because the turning of the year is the world coming home to the light. And I stood in that first light with a farmer's hand in mine, and my loyal dead risen around me and a dominion waiting to be taken back. And I understood that I had, against all the teaching of 900 years, come home, not to a throne, which had never once been home, but to the one place in the whole reach of my life where I had been seen, wholly and freely and for nothing, and chosen anyway. We did not fly out that dawn. Issel's fleet could wait a day. It had waited a year. We went back up the road to Hale's Reach in the first light of the new year, the whole crew and the old ground hauler, and a fleet warden of the Dominion riding in the back with the seed sacks because he would not be parted from his Empress again. And Sella made a breakfast for Empress and warriors and farmhands all at one long table, and told the lot of us to shut up and eat, and no one dared do otherwise. And before we left, I went into the machine barn where Gable stood on his charge plate, and I lifted the loose board in the corner, and I took up the circlet of star iron I had buried there in the dark, the last true thing of my old life. I did not put it on. I held it, and I looked at it, and then I did a thing that scandalized Issel Servan to the roots of his loyal soul. I gave it to the child. I found Wren in the yard, waiting to see the warriors ship the way children wait, and I knelt down in the snow in front of her, the way my fleet warden had knelt in front of me, and I put the circlet of the Sircon dynasty into her small hands, the band that is grown to a daughter at her nomming and burned with her at her death, and I said, "This was mine when I was an empress. I am something better now." You keep it, and when you're grown, you remember that the woman who gave it to you learned everything she knows about being worth anything at all from a farmer of Combe who pulled her out of the snow. The child looked at the crown in her hands and then up at me, and she said, with the pure and total seriousness of the very young, "Is Bram going to be an emperor?" And I laughed, the first true laugh, I think, of my whole life. And I looked across the yard to where Bram Hale stood loading seed sacks onto a ship that could burn a city, arguing quietly with a fleet warden about the proper way to stack them, entirely himself, entirely unimpressed, entirely home in his own skin, the way I was only just learning to be. "No," I told the child. "He's going to be exactly what he is. That's the whole of it. That's the whole of everything." And it was.